Hello there, and welcome to Speaking of Our Words, programming that brings you the wide range of voices, stories, and forms of local writers, and offering you some insight into their creative process. My name is Chris DeGuire. I teach creative writing workshops at Columbia College, Chicago, and I am your host. We have several guests today, all set to read. The first piece is going to be by regular contributor Richard Bell, who is not here today, so I am going to read his piece called Molly and Ollie. Molly had a cousin named Ollie, who raised collies for fun and profit. He had an assistant named Vern, who discerned that Ollie's love of collies was folly. Ollie thought the collies loved Holly, but by golly, it made them sick. Ollie even paid Vern with holly, and Vern borrowed Ollie's urn so he could burn the holly he earned. Vern yearned to turn Ollie into Molly, but his jolly sister Polly was against it. Polly and Molly picked the holly that Ollie used to pay Vern the holly he earned, but which ended up burned in his urn. One day, Polly bought a collie from Ollie, but it was sick from the holly, so she asked Vern to return the collie to Ollie. Vern took the collie on the trolley to go and meet with Ollie. Vern was stern, but Ollie, by golly, told Vern he could not return Polly's collie, because Molly thought it folly to return a collie that obviously just had a little indigestion. Polly told Molly what Ollie had said to Vern to learn why Molly was mollycoddling Ollie, and how to mollify Polly's collie that had eaten the holly. A decision was reached. Polly told Ollie that Molly said that feeding holly to a collie was sheer folly, and that all the holly Vern earned had been burned in his urn. Ollie was disappointed, and promised Vern that he'd no longer earn holly and could return the urn. Now Molly was upset and wanted to modify Ollie, by golly, to better care for the collies. She made Ollie promise to stop providing the holly to the collies, and Ollie agreed. Ollie would mollify Molly by mollycoddling the collies, and Vern, in turn, returned the urn, and was henceforth paid in cash, which did not make Ollie jolly, as it cut into his profits. This is called Captured by Aliens. A long time ago, Greg was captured by aliens who abducted him in the middle of the night. They questioned him for hours before probing him and letting him go. Of course he told them a bunch of lies, since he didn't owe them anything, and I think they finally realized that and got mad because they returned and captured him again. He was taken to their home planet, which is millions of light years away from here, and they imprisoned him in a lonely little room. He was forced to buy them dinner and give them presents in return for nothing. They tormented him daily to see what his reaction would be, and they fed off of his misery. They also did weird things to him sexually and always denied him his release. Wait a minute, that was a girl I dated a few times. And that is from Richard Bell. Richard Bell, thank you very much. All right. First in-studio reader today is going to be Walter Gascoigne. Hello, Walter.
Hi, Chris.
Walter, what do you have for us today?
A short story that might turn out to be much longer later on down the road.
All right, very good. All right, Walter Gascoigne, take it away.
It's called Inoculated. They blamed my parents and others like them for the cause of the outbreak. You see, my mother and father were taught differently than most people. They were raised off the grid by my grandparents who believed in a simpler way of life. The government agencies and regulatory commissions did not have us on record. Grandfather was extremely proud of this fact, and he would comment on it often. He loved to tell us why he decided to leave the city, and he would begin his story by lighting up a cigarette and slowly inhaling, the smoke from the fireplace mingling with his own. Your grandmother and I met just before the commission started. That was right around the same time the first inoculations began. We were married that same year, and not long after, she was pregnant with your father, he would say, as my dad listened, nodding his head in agreement. Within a year of his birth, those controlling bastards began making this vaccine mandatory for everyone. The government said it was for the good of the people, that by not getting inoculated it would only endanger yourself and others. The pharmaceutical companies named it Serenity Number 9. They argued that the benefits far outweighed whatever trivial side effects that there were. The newspaper said that the test cities had been inoculated and were doing far better than their projections had hoped for. Here grandfather would pause and spit into the fire, leaving a hissing sound as it crackled on the burning embers. There was no more crime, no more poverty, no violence, and overall it increased the amount of productivity, he said, as grandmother nodded her head and whispered to herself, and no more free will. Your grandmother's right. We saw it was coming, but it wasn't until the day we received the notice in the mail for us to report to the clinic within 7 days, or face the penalties, that we decided it was best to get as far away from any city as possible. We packed what little we had, and in the dead of night bundled up your father and left town without telling a soul. I would listen as the fire warmed my face and sip on hot tea as grandfather would tell of how we came to this place, about how we came across the like-minded neighbors that lived across the river and who had a daughter my father's age, about how they shared things through good times and bad, about how my mother and father fell in love after the loss of her parents. It would be in this part of the story I would jump up and say, "That's how I got to be here," and everyone would giggle. That all seems so long ago. My grandparents passed away within a month of each other. We buried them next to my other grandparents, the ones I never got to meet. The sadness I felt at their loss was a sharp pain that made me more focused and determined. Life went on as usual, and I began to assume the role of an adult. It was now my job to do the hunting and fishing, the gathering of wood, and the cultivation of the soil. And at night I would gaze down at the city lights and wonder what it was like to be living there, what it was like to always be happy. It was around my 16th birthday when my mother became ill. None of our usual remedies worked, and she worsened by the day. My father took me aside and told me that we needed to go back into the city. He knew it was risky, but it was the only chance my mother had, and he couldn't bear to lose her. He was afraid that if she died and something happened to him, that I would be all alone. This wasn't our first incursion into the city. Once or twice a year we'd dust off the old Buick and go pick up supplies that we could not make for ourselves. Only this time it sounded like my father meant to stay, at least until Mother got better. For the first time in my life I was afraid. What would they do if they caught us? Would they make me like them? Or would they put me on display in a zoo with all the happy faces smiling down at me while I took a dump for their amusement? With my help, we got my mother into the back seat, making her as comfortable as possible. As we drove down the small dirt path in the dim light of the evening sun, I looked behind us at the tiny cabin and wondered if I would ever see it again. On our way down the mountain, Father once again went over how we should act when we got there. Remember, always smile. Always. Even if you're in pain or see something disturbing. I nodded my head. This was the first rule I was ever taught, even though I rarely left the car when doing a supply run. Stay close to me. Don't get separated. Let me do the talking. As soon as Mother is better, we will get back home. I promise. He kissed me on the forehead, trying not to show how afraid he really was, but the look in his eyes told me different. The times that I went into town previously, it was always the same. People walking with huge grins on their faces, kids laughing, smiling store owners peering out behind windows as pedestrians passed by. The streets were clean, the cars were spotless, and the lawns were immaculate, but underneath you could feel a tension, like a spring that was wound up ready to uncoil. This time was no different. Everything was the same. As we pulled up to the emergency room doors, 2 grinning orderlies stepped out, and after speaking with my father, they put my mother on a gurney and wheeled her in. We parked the car, and before he went in to sign the paperwork, my father gave me a knowing glance, putting on a fake smile, while I did the same. My father gave them the fake names and identity numbers we had used before. No one questioned them or asked for ID. When we were finished, they took us to a room on the 5th floor where my mother was. On the way, we passed rooms with open doors that had patients lying in beds, while groups of people stood around laughing and talking. Occasionally, a nurse would enter, looking quite delightful as she went about doing her job. When we got to my mother's room, there was a doctor who took my father's hand and shook it with great enthusiasm, telling us her chances of ever recovering were almost none. She had a massive stroke, and the only thing the hospital could do was keep her comfortable until the inevitable happened. I could tell my father was having a hard time keeping the smile on his face. When the doctor pranced out of the room, he shut the door and began sobbing, large tears falling from his cheeks. We obtained a hotel room that was across the street. We were careful how we behaved. There were no locks on doors. They weren't needed because there was no crime or modesty, only happy people with happy thoughts. Whenever we went out, I would plaster a smile on my face, thinking about the time a frog landed in my grandpa's lap and made him fall over backwards in his chair. For the most part, it worked, but when I overheard some of the conversations people were having, I had to turn my head so that they would not see my face. "You look happy. Would you like to have sex?" a man would say to a woman he just met while crossing the street. "Only if it makes you happy," she would beam, and right there in the middle of the street they would drop their pants and rut like animals, while people passed by smiling. Every night we'd come back to the hotel room. Father would fall asleep from exhaustion while I watched television. I learned not much had changed in over 35 years. When everyone is inoculated, it made them content. Why build something better when what you have makes you happy just the way it is? There had been no progress other than the closing of the borders to keep those who were not inoculated out. Great walls had been built on the borders by happy workers, and most ties to other country had been severed. On the History Channel, they showed the roundup of the people who had refused to get inoculated. They put them into hospitals, and days later, whole families would come out holding hands as the cameraman zoomed in on their bristling teeth and taut faces. That night I awoke from a dream. My grandparents were holding me down. My mother's dead body lay in a casket next to me while my father poured a red liquid down my throat, screaming, "It's happy time, son." When I woke up, I had a smile on my face and tears in my eyes. A week passed as we spent our days by my mother's side and our nights at the hotel room. It was about the 8th or 9th day when I noticed things were different. Maybe it started before that, and I was too busy smiling to notice. I remember walking down the hospital corridor and seeing an old man in a wheelchair with his hands at his head, and it looked like he was crying. Later that day I saw a nurse drop a bedpan. Her smile turned to a frown, and she cursed at her bad luck. The anchorman for the news that night seemed to be more animated than usual, and he kept glancing off camera at something only he could see. My father and I were in the hospital room when my mother died. We weren't alone. Several nurses and a doctor were present. They began to tell me how happy I must be now that my mother was no longer suffering. They said they were happy too, and asked us to come down to the cafeteria and have a slice of cake with them. I could not take any more. I wailed, "You heartless bastards, you want to eat cake while my mother lies here dead? What kind of monsters are you?" "Unbelievable," the doctor said, grinning. "We haven't had a case of sadness in over 35 years. Do you know what irreparable harm could come from this? Nurses, subdue that patient." I backed up as far against the wall as I could, as swarming arms tried to pull me towards them. My father shouted to me to run as he flung himself onto the heap of smirking nurses, scattering them about the room, giving me time to run for the door, past the doctor, and down the hallway filled with smiling patients. That was the last time I seen my father. I quickly made my way to the hotel and grabbed what was necessary. Somewhere off in the distance, I heard the first police siren since coming into town. I raced down to the car and without looking back drove up the mountain and to our home. Sitting back in the familiar surroundings seemed to comfort me. The loss of my father and mother gave me purpose and determination. Listening to the broadcast over Grandpa's transistor radio, I heard the reports of mass suicides. I guess never knowing sadness and then feeling it for the first time could be traumatic. The news said that teams of inoculators were vaccinating anyone who showed symptoms of the sadness, but it was too late. Within a week, the happy people were outnumbered, and sadness overtook the country, which somehow made me feel immensely gratified. And for the first time since returning home, I smiled, a real, genuine smile that no vaccination could ever give me.
All right, Walter Gascoigne, thank you very much. Walter, you say this might be part of a longer piece. What do you feel are your plans with this?
I'd have to step back and take each little section and expand upon it, especially more like the ending, because I had to rush it. It felt hurried at the end because I was time constrained. We had to read this today, so if I would have had more time, it would have definitely been at least 3 pages longer, but I could see a whole novel in there somewhere if I just break it down and make it even more personal.
Yeah, cool. All right, very good, very good. All right, Walter Gascoigne, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and next up is Greg DeGuire. Hello, Greg.
Howdy.
All right, Greg, what do you have for us today?
Well, basically, I took a series of 4 books and 6 mediocre films and did them better.
All right.
But kind of this is based on things that I've noticed during my working career thus far.
All right. So would you say this is a work of fiction?
Most definitely.
All right.
Yes.
Very good. All right.
And it's a satire piece, I guess, is what you want to. This idea was bouncing around in my head for so long because of things that I noticed, and I thought, wow, this really sounds like something else. I'm gonna have to put this on paper, and this is what I've burped up so far.
All right. Very good. Greg DeGuire, take it away.
The Lord of the Drug Rings. The world was changing. Stephen could feel it in the air. He had been using drugs for so long he had forgotten the taste of bread. It began with the forging of contacts. 7 department heads and leads, 9 truck drivers and distributors, 3 of the store managers, but not the store director. There was something special about him. With these contacts and buyers, he was able to sell a lot, so he could even start to grow a lot, which led to him using the drugs as well. They were precious to him. Stephen and his brother Deacon had come to an ending of sorts. It was either their lives or the drugs. They both stood in Stephen's basement apartment bathroom in front of the toilet. The lid was up. All they had to do was drop the many bags of drugs down the toilet and rid the world of its evil for good. Deacon was the first to hold his bags over the bowl. His eyes were closed. He said, "I have to destroy these for both our sakes." Just as he was about to drop the first bag, Stephen shoved Deacon to the cold tiled floor. As Deacon fell, he hit his head in the corner of the sink. The wound was fatal. As he lay on the floor, he could hear Stephen shouting, "No!" Then he saw Stephen take the bags that he was going to destroy. As his life was fading, he heard his brother say, "The drugs are mine." As he watched Stephen leave the room, his eyes closed and he slipped into darkness. At the time, Stephen did not realize he had killed his brother. After he left the bathroom, he went to get his bong so he could try to relax. With his bong in hand, he went to go apologize to Deacon. "Deacon, get up. We need to sell these, not destroy them. We can get rich, then quit." He knelt down and realized that Deacon was gone. Stephen turned a pale color of white and shriveled into himself. "Murderer, they'll call me. I have to hide the body here or my enemies will double," he thought to himself. "I'll hide here for a few days, then try to sell this off. Then maybe I can get out." Little did Stephen know the drugs had a will of their own. They called to him, and he heard his master's call. Days, it seemed, had passed by. Stephen did have an appointment to keep before he slipped into a drug-induced brief coma. He made contact with his main buyers and possible heirs to his drug ring. It was 3 a.m. He had made it to his contact point. A few blocks from where he lived was his local grocery store. He had been supplying and selling drugs to the department heads, truck drivers, and vendors there for a long time. He waited at the back docking door. The overnight stalkers knew the time and a special knock. After the secret knock, a small sliding peephole slid open. Stephen whispered the code word, "Friend," and the bay door had opened. To his surprise, it wasn't the night crew chief, it was the store director, Ron. He had only heard stories of Ron, but never met him. But he knew what he looked like. He heard tell that Ron was a very old and sour man. In fact, Old Sour Ron was his nickname, and now he stood before a very pale and nervous Stephen. He stood in shock for just a few moments, then he turned and ran like hell. The back of the store was an alley of sorts. He ran down that alley fast. He had made it a block away. He then crossed the street, but had to hurry because a delivery truck was bearing down on him fast, and he didn't want to get hit. Bill and his brother Bo had been delivering for Hillshire Farms for about 5 years. They had been customers of Stephen's for about 3 years. They were growing uneasy with Stephen and Deacon. They wanted out of the partnership. They wanted the business for themselves. The drugs were precious to them as well. They got a text from Stephen the other day that made them very nervous. It said, "Must unload all of my Green Day CDs. Need to be rid of this burden." So they brought extra money in case this would finally be the night that they get the precious drugs. It was just after 3 a.m. that they were getting close to the store. Bo was behind the wheel. "Bo, watch out. Don't hit that stupid kid running in front of us," Bill snapped. "Jesus, is that Stephen?" asked Bo. "Holy crap, it is. Slow down and let me out. I'm going to run after him, see where he goes. I want those drugs," Bill yelled. Bill struggled to keep up after Stephen. For a crackhead, he ran pretty good. He was an expert at eluding the police and store management. Bill saw him running to a bar that was just a few blocks from the store. Misty's Bar and Grill. Bill knew this place. Misty was an ex-stripper that had giant fake boobs. It drew in the local biker gang crowd. The sign inside the bar said, "Stop in and see Misty's Mountains." So Stephen was under Misty's. He always wondered where his hideout was. Bill called Bo in his cell. "Bo, I found Stephen. Make the delivery and meet me at Misty's. We can end this before dawn, so hurry Hurry up. Stephen ran inside the side entrance to Misty's. It was the only way into the basement from the outside. He ran downstairs and gathered all of his drugs into a giant duffel bag. He knew it was time to leave, but he was tired after his close call and wanted to rest first. So he crashed in his couch, far enough away from the smell of his brother's dead body lying in the bathtub. As he was losing consciousness, the bag of drugs fell from his hand. A deep sleep took over Stephen. Stephen opened his eyes slowly, woken from his deep sleep by a noise in his kitchen. He moved slowly and quietly to see what was happening. He only saw the back of a burglar in his kitchen. This thief was sampling some of the coke that was in his bag of drugs. This thief turned and saw Steve, and he froze, dropping a small bag of meth from the bag. "Crap," the burglar said quietly. Now Stephen was between him and the stairway up to the entrance to the bar. Stephen still didn't see his face. Bill was now feeling a huge high from the coke. The high, he thought, was turning him invisible with power. I could just jump over Stephen. He can't really see me anyways, Bill thought. Bill sniffed the last bit that was left in his fingertip and tried to leap over Stephen. Stephen saw the figure try to leap over him. He grabbed the thief's jacket and pulled him down. He heard a rip from the coat. Maybe he got a piece of the burglar's shirt. Bill hit the ground hard, but he was feeling invincible, so he leapt back up even though part of his jacket had ripped off, and ran up the stairs into the main bar. Misty's had a special bar license. She catered to second and third shift workers, so she was open very late or very early, depending on how you looked at it. The bikers in the bar were a mean, dirty bunch. A few of them had purchased from Steve in the past, but kept coming back to see Misty's Mountains. She was very popular. From behind the bar, she saw a man fly up from the basement stairs. She never got a good look at him. He was moving too fast. He seemed invisible to her. He ran out the front door just as a very angry Stephen was trying to keep up. He was screaming, "Thief! Has my bag! Thief! I hate you forever!" Stephen found himself in the middle of the bikers. This was bad. Recently he took some of their money but had not filled their orders. The orders were in the bag that was just stolen. The bikers started to beat the crap out of Stephen. "Where's our drugs?" they yelled. It was then that Stephen looked in his clenched fist and saw a bit of the jacket torn from the burglar. Bill and Shire were on the patch of jacket he had while the bikers were beating him. He yelled, "Bill! Bag! Shire!" over and over. Finally the bikers let him go. Stephen got to his feet, sort of. He yelled at the bikers as he walked back down the stairs. Screw you, you dorks," was all he could manage as a comeback to his beating. Misty noticed a horrible smell coming up from the basement. She wondered where Deacon was. No, she thought, he couldn't have. She knew the drugs would have a bad ending with these two. Did something happen to Deacon, she wondered. Stephen slumped back on his couch. As he was sitting, he noticed the bag of meth that dropped out during the ordeal. Screw it, he thought. I want to get high as hell and get out of here. Hours had passed. There was a knocking at the outside of the door leading to the basement. A very loud knocking. He went up the steps to the door and saw 9 police cars. They saw him through the door and he froze. They broke the door down and grabbed him. They kept asking him if he was Stephen Collins, but he was still high on meth and coughing badly. All he could manage to say in a low, growling voice was, "Collins, Collins," he said while coughing, and he wept They stole it, he said. They stole it. The arresting officer asked, "Stole what?" Stephen turned and very slowly looked at the cop and said very calmly but very loudly, "My precious bag of drugs," and then screamed at them. Stephen could not stand the sound of sirens. "Turn them off," he begged. They sound like screaming or a high-pitched wailing to him. Then the officer put on cold handcuffs. Stephen screamed, "Ah, the cuffs burns us. It burns our wrists. Take them off us," he begged. Cops just shook their heads. Damn drugs have really twisted this poor guy. He looked like pale skin and bones.
All right, Greg DeGuire, I don't know what movies you watched that influenced you. It'll be just one of those unanswered riddles in the dark.
Uh-huh.
So do you have any plans for this? Is this part of a longer piece, do you think?
Oh, I got more, yeah. I want to have like the in-store security guy who wants to help Collins, a fellow by the name of Randolph. Of course, we know where that one's going to go. One of the department managers, he's a really tall guy, who wants to help also because it's like 7 foot tall, so he has a large stride, drives a Red Ranger. Okay, we know where this is going. He also owns his own restaurant that I want to work into the deal somehow. He owns a restaurant up north that has, for whatever reason, winds take sand from the beaches from the lake and deposit them in front of this guy's restaurant. So he calls this restaurant with big glass windows. You can see the sand dunes. The name of his restaurant is called the Dune and Dine. Of course, we know where that's
is.
going.
Of course it is.
This all just seems to make sense to me. I don't know why no one's thought of this before.
Well, we look forward to hearing future installments. All right,
Good.
Greg DeGuire, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and next up is Ron Larson. Hello, Ron.
Hi, Chris.
Ron, what do you have for us today?
Well, and now for something completely different. I'm planning on writing a nonfiction, history book about the Battle of Shiloh and the reporters that were there. It's based on my master's thesis. So it's called The Battle and the Journalists, So this is an excerpt, a 3-page excerpt kind of from, an early draft of that nonfiction history book.
All right, very good. Well, Ron Larson, take it away.
In the early morning of Sunday, April 6, 1862, Henry Bentley, a correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, was having a hard time getting a good night's sleep. At about 1:30 in the morning, Bentley was awakened by the clear voice of the commanding officer ordering his men to fall in. The interruption was only temporary, however, as he dreamily turned on his side and tried to get back to sleep. "How little I thought of the danger that surrounded me," he later wrote. Bentley, nicknamed the Waterspout Man and Munchausen because of his enormous stories of his personal adventures, was considered the most incessant babbler and braggart in the crowd of the reporters. On this morning, he was the guest of Colonel Everett Peabody, the 31-year-old commander of the 25th Missouri Infantry Regiment, and an acting brigadier general and brigade commander in Brigadier General Benjamin Prentice's division of Grant's Army of the Tennessee. Peabody, who was physically imposing, standing over 6 feet in height and weighing 240 pounds, was a Harvard-trained engineer who had acquired the reputation as the best field engineer in the West while building Western railroads. This morning, he had a lot on his mind. The afternoon before, while General Prentice was reviewing Colonel Peabody's brigade, Confederate cavalry were seen in the adjoining woods. Several of Peabody's officers reported it to Prentice, who ordered 5 companies of the 25th and 21st Missouri Infantry Regiments to make a reconnaissance. The soldiers returned after sunset and reported no enemy in their front. Later that evening, Peabody received a report that contradicted the earlier one. Captain Gilbert Johnson of the 12th Michigan had just come back from the picket line. He reported that he could see long lines of Confederate campfires and hear bugle sounds and drums. Sometime after midnight, Colonel Peabody, feeling uneasy, ordered Major James Powell to reconnoiter up to a mile in front of the Federal line and see if he could find any Confederates. Powell took 3 companies of the 25th Missouri and 2 from the 12th Michigan, about 400 men. It was apparently these officers' shouts and orders that woke Bentley from his uncomfortable sleep. A little after 5 a.m., Powell's patrol ran into the Confederate pickets posted in front of the Confederate main line and engaged them in a firefight. Bentley was awake by then. George, his colored servant, was preparing his breakfast. As the firing continued, Colonel Peabody and Bentley, regarding the firing as only a sharp skirmish, sat down to enjoy their breakfast. Sometime before 6 a.m., the firing grew warmer. Killed and wounded from the skirmish were brought in and laid in front of Peabody's headquarters. A messenger from Major Powell arrived and reported that 3,000 of the enemy were in front of him and were slowly driving his men back. Shortly after this, Brigadier General Prentice arrived at Peabody's headquarters and asked Peabody what that firing meant. Peabody explained he had sent out a patrol. Prentice, angry, reproached the colonel, saying that he had brought on an engagement for which the army was not prepared, and told Peabody that he would be held personally responsible for bringing on a battle. The quick-tempered Peabody was offended at the tone of General Prentice, and angrily replied that he was personally responsible for all of his actions. He ordered an aide to bring his horse and sat down to eat his breakfast with Bentley, using his camp chest as a table. Around 6 a.m., Peabody ordered Colonel David Moore with 5 companies of the 21st Missouri to support Powell's patrol. Colonel Peabody and Bentley had just finished an egg and a cup of coffee each when the noise of the shooting redoubled. Having apparently all he could take, Colonel Peabody sprang up and ordered the beating of the long roll, the call to arms. The men were just beginning to cook their breakfasts, Bentley observed, and the camp chests of many an officer had already been spread with eggs and such dainties as would serve to commemorate a Sunday. Bentley told George to place the eggs, ham, and coffee on his camp chest in order to show the invaders that they had commenced their day systematically. Colonel Peabody mounted his horse and rode toward the fighting. Bentley later wrote, "Instantly upon the call of the drum, Every tent became vacant, horses were saddled in haste, and the men formed in line of battle, marching out into the woods beyond without faltering. The beating of the drums in adjoining camps denoted that the alarm was already general, but it was useless to deny what was at once evident. We had been surprised. So there you go, the beginning of the Battle of Shiloh.
All right. So, I mean, obviously, this is an excerpt of a much larger piece, your thesis work. How did you sort of employ, any fictional storytelling techniques? How did you discover the voice, of this? I mean, because obviously, when you're writing nonfiction, I mean, you're still, in essence, with this, I would assume the whole thesis, you're still telling a story. So how did you employ any sort of fictional techniques to get this on the page the way you did?
Well, I mean, I think that, whether you write fiction or nonfiction, I'm not saying it's good writing, but good writing is good writing, grammar so I find that, I rewrite a lot, actually, these nonfiction pieces to kind of get it as clear and as unornamental as possible, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, just, good writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I mean, it would, is good,
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I can really say is that it tries to be good writing. I try to make it clear and, not confusing or flowery or whatever.
Yeah.
All
right, very good. Well, Ron Larson, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and next up is going to be Jim Janus. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Chris.
Jim, and what do you have for us today?
I have a short story. It's called The Land of 2,000 Lakes. Now, I read the beginning of this last time, and it was the literary version. I read about half of it. This is the verbal storytelling version that I performed on February 12th at Story Night at Fusion. So there's a subtle difference between the two.
All right, very good. All right, Jim Janus, take it away.
Okay, and I'm just going to preface this with Camila and I. There are two characters in this story. Since the story was written, we're no longer married. Northeast Poland. The region is called Mazurski. It's the land of 2,000 lakes. I got to go there one summer 15 years ago, right after I married Camila, the second marriage for each of us. She told me her uncle wanted to meet me, to size me up, to see if I could handle her. So we flew from O'Hare, and 8 hours later we landed at Warsaw's Chopin Airport. There, Uncle Yannick picked us up. He lifted our bags into the trunk of his dusty Renault, and he drove us away from the airport, north and east. And as we got further north and further east, I started seeing through the back windows the great fields of wheat, the pine forests, and the beautiful blue lakes. Poland was just as I had imagined it when I was a boy reading the Teutonic Knights. In about 4 hours we arrived at the hotel. Uncle Yannick helped us check in and carry our bags to the room. After that we left the hotel to continue on with Uncle Yannick to his place to meet Camila's aunt and cousins. But before getting into the car, Uncle Yannick led us across the hotel grounds to a small pier that jutted out onto a beautiful lake, one of the 2,000. There a young man was renting boats for fishing. Uncle Yannick spoke to him. Camila told me he asked, "How much per hour?" The young man seemed the same age as Camila, and I saw them look at each other, Camila and this guy, like they knew each other. Before this trip, I tried to learn Polish. I listened to vocabulary CDs during my commute to and from the office. Now, in the car on the way to the cousins, I listened to Camila and her uncle speak the language, and he sounded upset with her. I tried hard to understand what he was saying, but the only words I understood were "Woodja," "Lithium," and "Kohanik." Boats, high school, and boyfriend. In an hour, we turned right off the 2-lane highway and pulled into the cousin's yard. It was a kind of courtyard defined by a brick house, 2 stone barns, one on either side of the yard, and a wooden barn in the back. Camila told me the brick house dated back to World War I, as did the 2 stone barns, which were once used for keeping pigs. From the back door of the brick house came Camila's cousins, Adam and Edic, both shirtless, red from the sun and smiling. Each held a tall can of beer in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. Camila said to me, "They're taking you fishing. I'll drive." We all crowded into a tiny, red, two-door Fiat, and I found myself in the back seat, squished between the shirtless Adam and Edic. Up front, Uncle Yannick gave Camila directions. She pulled out onto the two-lane highway and turned left in the direction of the hotel and the lake and the boats. But just 10 minutes into the ride, Yannick gave another instruction. Camila slowed the car, and she made a hairpin turn to the right onto a sort of frontage road. This frontage road ran alongside the two-lane highway on the right and a great field on the left. Soon, the paved road became a gravel road, and it curved left away from the two-lane highway into the field. Then the gravel road became just 2 tire tracks with grass growing between. Then it became all grass, and I could hear the grass brushing against the bottom of the car, and I saw the grass rising above the windows. When we couldn't see anymore because of the tall grass, I heard Yannick tell Camila to stop the car. Camila stopped the car and looked over her shoulder at me, and she said, "You guys are getting out here." So we got out of the car, and Camila called to me through the open window, "I'll be back in a couple hours to pick you guys up." And I watched the roof of the tiny red two-door Fiat disappear into the tall grass. So there I was, in the beautiful Polish countryside, ready to fish, but there was no lake, just a line of trees. At that moment, I remembered a film from 1971 called Straw Dogs. In Straw Dogs, Dustin Hoffman plays a mathematician who moves with his bride from the U.S. to her hometown in rural England. And I particularly remember the scene where a few guys from the village take the mathematician into a remote field on a snipe hunt, while his bride's former boyfriend stays behind to hook up with her. I was woken out of this memory by Uncle Yannick calling, "Hutch, Jimmy." I followed my in-laws through the line of trees, and on the other side, it was exactly the same, another great field. Except here was a backhoe, a piece of construction equipment, yellow, with big black tires, with a loader in front and a scoop in back. And next to it was a rectangular pond of stagnant black water, no bigger than an Olympic-sized swimming pool. In this land of 2,000 lakes, this is where Camila's uncle and cousins took me to fish. Edic handed me his fishing rod, then walked away to lie down in the tall grass. Uncle Yannick took on the role of fishing guide. He helped Adam and me bait our hooks. Then Adam and I moved a few yards apart with Uncle Yannick between us, and the two of us cast straight ahead, being careful not to overshoot the pond. In about a minute, I heard Adam say something and point to his bobber. It was twitching. He set the hook and reeled in a small fish. The fish looked like a carp, but it was not much bigger than a goldfish. Adam's catch triggered a celebration among the in-laws. I reeled in my line, but had nothing. Adam and I cast straight out a second time. Uncle Yannick started saying something to me in Polish, some sort of direction I didn't understand. In another minute, Adam's bobber was twitching again. He set the hook and reeled in a second small fish. There was another celebration. I reeled in my line, nothing. Adam and I cast straight out a third time, and now Uncle Yannick was really giving it to me in Polish, almost yelling at me. Again, Adam's bobber twitched. He set the hook and reeled in a third small fish. I reeled in nothing. Adam cast straight out a fourth time, and this time, I aimed for Adam's bobber and I cast diagonally. I landed my hook right next to his. At this, Uncle Yannick rejoiced. "Dobrze, dobrze." And I figured out what he'd been trying to tell me, something like, "Look, you idiot, Adam's catching all the fish. Why don't you cast where he's casting?" The fishing afternoon quieted down. Edic continued to lie and drink in the grass. Adam and I continued to watch our bobbers. At that point, Yannick turned to me, looked me in the eye with a smile, and said in perfect English, "I am Camila's godfather." It meant a lot to me that he said this in English, and I answered, "That's nice." and as I turned back to check my bobber, Uncle Yannick kind of wandered behind me, and then I heard... And I thought, what is that? A little while later, we all heard a beep, beep in the distance, and Yannick said, "Ah, yes, Camilla." So we pulled together our things. Cousin Edic got up from the grass, and we walked through the line of trees, and visible above the tall grass was the roof of the tiny red two-door Fiat. We all got in. I was again squished in the back between Adam and Edic. Camilla drove us back through the tall grass, which started getting shorter. Then the tire tracks appeared, and then the gravel road and the frontage road. And in 10 minutes, we were back in the cousin's yard. Camilla's aunt was there preparing a picnic. Near the house was a campfire with stumps arranged around it for sitting. Some other cousins sat there, extending a stick over the fire. On one end of the stick was a sausage. Adam and Edic came into the yard, each cracked open another tall can of beer, and they tossed me an unopened one. And Uncle Yannick wandered to one of the 2 stone barns, and he called out to me, "Hotch, Jimmy." I walked over to him and met him in the open doorway to the barn. He gestured for me to go inside. I stepped in, and Uncle Yannick stepped in behind me. Inside it was dark. There were some cracks in the wall that let in the late afternoon sun, and there was just enough light for me to see a wooden staircase that led up to a loft. Uncle Yannick gestured for me to go up, so I started going up the stairs, and he followed behind me. And as I neared the top, I heard... And I thought, what is going to happen? At the top of the staircase, where the loft began, was an antique scale, the kind with 2 round trays, one on either side of a pointer. And this thing was big, once used for weighing pigs or parts of pigs or feed. And then Yannick spoke and gestured again for me to get on to one side of the scale. So I crouched down and stepped onto one of the 2 giant trays. And onto the other giant tray, Uncle Yannick placed weights, adding some and removing others, until it became perfectly balanced. Then he exclaimed in Polish, "Ah, 84 kilograms. 84 kilograms, or 185 pounds, my exact weight at that time." It turns out Uncle Yannick had found this scale years ago, was very proud of it, and liked to show it to new visitors. Camilla and I visited for 2 weeks, and on our last morning there, Uncle Yannick drove to the hotel to pick us up. Camilla got into the car, and while Yannick and I lifted the last suitcase into the trunk, Yannick then walked to the driver's side and got in. As I started to walk to the passenger side, I looked back at the hotel. It was very early in the morning, so the sky was just starting to get light, and under the veranda, I noticed a guy standing there, watching. And I swear it was the same guy who rented the boats. He was standing there as if he wanted Camilla to see him, as if he wanted her not to leave, as if he wanted to be with her again. This all happened 15 years ago, the summer I traveled to Mazursky, the land of 2,000 lakes, when Camilla's uncle got to meet me, when he sized me up, and when I started to wonder if I could handle her.
All right, Jim Janus, thank you very much. A couple of things I want to talk about here. I know Ron and Walter, you also performed at this oral storytelling program. I know Greg, you've done live radio before, and even though this show is taped, we try to make this have a sort of live feel about it. What I'm curious, and Jim, I do want to start with you, since you just gave us the story. How did this oral storytelling event affect you as a writer, and what did it make you think about with your writing? I mean, obviously, when you I know when you guys did this show, you had these stories memorized. I mean, the Ron and Walter, the pieces you read today were not the pieces you read at this event, but in performing these live in front of an audience, and especially right now, Jim, reading this. Again, yes, how did that affect you as a writer? And again, what does it make you think about when you approach writing a story, whether you're going to read it aloud, off the page or in front of an audience? How's this all affected you?
For me, it made me really understand how it's two separate art forms. So writing a piece of literature versus performing, especially for a live audience, two different art forms, and both very interesting to me. So I have some experience just from listening to National Public Radio and hearing some of their storytelling shows. So when this idea came up, I just kind of thought to some stories that I would naturally tell friends, like people the first time I met them, or when I would remember a trip like this, for example. And so when the storytelling event got into the planning phase, I just started taking that story that I had told multiple times and wanted to capture it. And one thing that I really learned is it's a different process. So I first started writing it down in the way that I read a month ago on the radio show, in more literary format with longer sentences, a lot more descriptions. And I had to learn what my process was for really recording it in the spoken format with the short sentences. And even on the paper, I structure it differently. It looks more like a poem. It's one lines, and they're kind of broken into sections.
Mm-hmm. And how much do you feel when you perform this then? Because I do agree. I think it is a totally separate art form when you're there in front of an audience, just telling the story. How much did you create like on the spot? How much do you feel that you might have left out or forgot, or did you embellish anything, or did you exaggerate anything when you were doing this performance?
The words are very close to what I read here. I would say I was probably a little more conversational in my delivery at the show. And then also being in a live performance on stage, it enables you to use more body language. So I was able to use more hand gestures. The part where I'm stepping on a scale, I tried to make it look like I was actually crouching over and stepping onto a scale. Another big part of it is the visual.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that, I know we were talking last night after our Kenosha Writers Guild meeting, and you were talking about how you practice this and you rehearsed it and you rehearsed it and you rehearsed it. I really like this idea of using gesture like you're talking about, because gesture is one of these elements that we incorporate into our workshops that I teach at Columbia College. So did you rehearse the gestures? Did the gestures sort of come naturally to you as you were telling the story, either in rehearsal or even there on the stage? How did that come about, using these gestures?
Yeah, so at home, I've got a little flip video camera that I can attach to a tripod, and so I actually recorded myself performing this multiple times, and then I would watch it, and that's where I could see myself doing the gestures. And I think just by going through iterations of watching myself, and then adding more gestures to the story, I think that helped a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Walter, I'm going to ask you some of the same questions. How do you feel that this oral storytelling event affected you as a writer, and what did it make you think about, as a writer, for when you approach, actual writing of a story or anything like that?
That's funny you mention that, because it's the same thing as I mentioned earlier. Basically, the story is an outline. So what I memorized, because I don't have the best memory, thanks to some certain items, but I had an outline that I had in my head. Start with start with the description of Chris. B, start where we went. C, I had an outline in my head. Other than that, I had a couple of images in my head, but it was pretty much on the spot, just made up as I went along, and I think that worked out well. I think if I would have tried to practice it like Jim and try to memorize everything, I think I would have been even more stumbling over my words.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a lot freer than writing is. I mean, it was essentially the same story, but I think if I told it 100 different times, it'd be 100 different ways that it would sound.
Yeah, and I would think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, I know when I did an oral storytelling presentation several years ago for our Story Week Festival of Writers, and we didn't have a whole lot of rehearsal time, but we got together as a group, and trying to memorize the stuff just does not, at least for me, it doesn't really work. You want this to sound like it's being natural. Now, I didn't have the opportunity to actually see this event that you guys did last week, but How were you? Were you able somehow, Walter, to incorporate gesture into your storytelling?
I think it was because I was so nervous that I had to do something with my hands to clear the sweat off a little bit.
Now, how do you feel this experience is going to affect you as you continue with your writing, as you think of audience in particular, with whatever thing you're going to be working on, whether it's going to be for your own amusement or to share with the group or to maybe publish someday, or even perhaps for future oral storytelling events?
Let's see. The way it's going to affect my writing style, I think, is that I'll be able to use some of my stories as a storytelling event, some of the written stories as a verbal story, and as long as I keep the outline, I think, original, and I could ad lib in between some of the parts, and I think every time it should come out, as long as I'm natural with it and have it in order, I think it'll always turn out well.
Interesting. And Ron, I'll pose these same questions to you again. How did this event sort of affect you as a writer? How do you feel you might be approaching your writing now differently because of doing this? I don't know. I don't know what kind of experience you've had, being in front of an audience like that and telling the story. But how do you feel that affected you as a person, as an artist, as a writer?
Yeah, it was interesting. So the story I told was, a version of a written piece that I have already, right? So so I took my original written article or short story, whatever, and then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna modify this for the spoken word. And in the process of doing that, like Jim said, I realized, oh my gosh, this is completely how I wanted to speak this is very different, or pretty different, from the way I've written it. And what I found myself doing was making it more simple. In essence, I actually got to a point where eventually, after kind of working on this for a couple days, trying to cut it down or just make it more spoken friendly, I basically ended up with bullet points. I got down to a dozen and a half bullet points. I'm like, just remember these topics, and because it was a true story, I don't, I didn't have to memorize it. It just, So basically, it's recounting my experience. Just remember these bullet points so that you don't forget, an element of the story that you want to put in there or whatever. And then you can talk about gestures. Well, first of all, practice. So I only practiced it because it was true, and I've told it to friends a dozen times. I only practiced it for running time, because we were supposed to keep it to 10 minutes. And the first time I told the story to, myself in my bedroom, it was 23 minutes. And so I'm like, okay, I need to cut this a little bit here, whatever. And then the other thing that you touched on with Jim and Walter was this idea of gestures. That, in my case, I feel pretty comfortable talking in front of people, and I was a TA at UW Milwaukee, and when you have to lead discussion sections, that's really good experience. And but I got to a point where I was relating. Part of the story is where I'm talking with two other people in kind of this triad. We're standing in this in this road, and I kind of went. I pointed with my left arm. When one person would speak, the other person would translate it, and then kind of back to me. So I kind of did this triangular pointing to give a visual of what it was like. And that wasn't so much intentional as just natural, automatic. Just that's what I felt like doing that. But I think people then told me that helped them kind of visualize the physical situation,
Jim, I see you nodding over there. Do you have anything else you want to add to this?
I was just going to say, I agree with that. That was really good. Demonstrating that three-way conversation using the hand gestures, it really did make it more effective.
I know, because one of my questions was going to be what sort of time frame did you have, and you answered that question from around. I know when I did my event a couple years ago, we had to keep it to about 7 to 8 minutes, and we also had a live band accompanying us. So for certain emphasis in the story, the band would break into music. I know when I did mine was all pre-recorded music. But there's still, so there was with that, there was a total element of timing that you had to have, between me and the guy, running the sound system and with the other readers of that night and with the band. So, I just and I know because of the time, I know my piece was, well, it ended up being like 9 or 10 pages, and then you read that out loud, and of course that takes about 15, 20 minutes, and I had the same thing. Okay, so where do I cut? And I gotta cut this, and we were fortunate. We worked with some editors for this group, some people who've been running this particular program for a long time, and what it really came down to is trying to figure out what the story was about. So I don't know if that was an influence with you guys, and for those of you who had to find ways to cut, I don't know, Walter or Jim, if you had to cut some things to get to this, but how was that trying to find what the essence of the story was? Yeah,
do you want to say so? Let me jump in there quick before the other two, and that is that, yes, so in having to cut this thing like by more than half or whatever, I'm like, okay, well, what's the most important part? Mm-hmm. What is the essential part here? And and it's that. So then I kind of identified that, and yeah, that helped clarify that.
Yeah, Walter.
So as a writer, what you're doing, you're trying to add as few details, but as many as you can without overdoing it. But you're also you're adding in all them details to make it sound, the fading sun, like I said, the smoking pipe, but all the little details like that when you're telling a real story to somebody, you're gonna leave out. You're not gonna tell them, yeah, my grandfather was over there having a cigarette while I was telling the story. So yeah, all that got cut. All the description, all the descriptive stuff got cut, and I got right to the basic heart of the story. What's going on.
Sure.
Yeah. And I actually went over the time limit. I probably went about 12 and a half minutes. Like we said, we were shooting for 10. Mm-hmm. There was nothing that I wanted to take out of the story. I felt everything was important, and key was I wanted the humor in there. So there's the fishing scene and then that barn scene. Both of those were really key, and there was important elements I needed to do to set those up. So I went over the time frame just to keep everything in there, which I think was all necessary.
Sure. Now, Greg, we got about 30 seconds or so here, but you did live radio for a number of years, and sometimes you found you had to find to actually use, you had to fill time sometimes.
Yeah, well,
depending on what guests you maybe had on or anything like that.
So the things I used to write down would be topical stories. So whatever guest we have on, I'd try to find a story about what they did, or things that they had seen to lead into that. So in essence, I usually, like these guys said, I started off writing Gone with the Wind, but by the time I got done with it, it was an episode of the A-Team. So you really had to gut it and narrow it down, especially for radio. If you don't keep it popping, all of a sudden you can hear the dials changing to something better than our show.
Yeah.
So you really had to get right to the meat of the bone. If there was time afterwards, you can go, oh, geez, I was going to say this, but I wasn't sure about time. What about that? Sometimes you're able to go back to that, and sometimes you're not. And other times you just got to hit it where it hurts.
Yeah. All right, very good. Well, I would love to talk more about this, but we do have to wrap it up for the day. So we have with us Lisa Adamowicz Kless, who is president of the Kenosha Writers Guild. Lisa, if someone wants to join the Kenosha Writers Guild, what do they need to do?
Well, we are a free group. All of our meetings and special events are free and open to the public. So basically, we would just encourage you to come on down to a meeting and see what we're all about.
All right, very good. And you can check us out at KenoshaWritersGuild.com. So if you have any questions or comments, or you wish to participate on this program, again, please visit KenoshaWritersGuild.com and come to one of our meetings. And feel free to visit our Facebook page, Speaking of Our Words, and please feel free to leave comments on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. Thank you to Dave Cole and Steve Brown and Nita Hunter and Troy McDonald, Lisa Adamowicz Kless, and the Kenosha Writers Guild. Our guests today, Walter Gascoigne, Greg DeGuire, Ron Larson, Jim Janus, Richard Bell. This is Chris DeGuire. The world needs your stories. We will see you again. Thank you for listening.